As promised, here we are. It's time to look through the differences between the different types of vertebrae, kind of see why they're different and how you could understand them. So let's get into it. This is the cervical vertebrae, and there are, again, 7 of them. The top 2 are special in that they are involved in supporting the head directly and giving it some of its kind of amazing range of motion. If you think about it, you can nod your head, you could swivel it side to side, and you're not twisting your neck as far as your head is moving. So it's not like your cervical vertebrae are all moving to accommodate your head at all times. The top 2 are doing a lot of that movement. They're doing more than you would predict of their movement. So we'll see that in a second. But all of the cervical vertebrae have some distinct features. For example, they have a transverse foramina. So these 2 little holes. And those, I can show you here. Let's see. If I were to give this person back all their bones and look at the cervical vertebrae, there are the transverse foramina, and we just would not see those on any other vertebrae. They aren't there on thoracic or lumbar. And what those are for, if I can put in the arteries, primarily is for what's called the vertebral arteries, that are one of the 2 routes blood can take to get into the brain. So right, and we'll get to that when we get to that. Also, there are come on, where are you? Little tiny vertebral veins that are minor, and we won't even cover them in this class because there's not much flow through them compared to the massive jugular veins. Okay, so that's enough of that. So that's the transverse foramina, and that you're going to see on C3 through C7. So C1 and C2 are these weird, sorry, what am I saying? I keep forgetting. So those are the transverse foramina, and you'd see them on, let's pause. Okay, so these are the transverse foramina, and all of the cervical vertebrae have them. You can't see them on the atlas or C2 here because these giant superior articular facets block your view, but transverse foramina are under there, just like they're under here. So that's one of the most distinctive things about cervical vertebrae. If you find those foramina, that's what you're looking at, cervical vertebrae. Okay, so then we now look at the 2 distinct, unique cervical vertebrae. C1, the atlas, this is the mythical bone that holds up the entire head. This is the vertebra that supports only the weight of the head. And as you are learning the structures of the skull, you would have found the occipital condyles. Those are going to articulate, they're going to articulate here with the superior articular facets of the atlas. And the atlas is a little bit harder to find your way around than the other vertebrae are going to be because it doesn't really have a spinous process. It doesn't, yeah, there are things it's missing. So you'll just have to spend some time with it and see how it goes together. But yeah, what this is going to do is allow nodding of the head, flexion and extension. To some extent, the occipital condyles are going to be able to move against this facet. Let's see what else. What else I can show you? The axis is C2, and from this superior view, you really don't see what it's about. But this this lateral view, you really would. These superior articular facets face directly superiorly towards the atlas, That's the bone we just saw. And this one starts to look more like a normal vertebra with a spinous process and transverse processes and the inferior articular processes that get their own structure. But this is definitely unique in that it also has this dens or odontoid process which sticks up here. And that is going to stick up through here, right through here. And what this is going to allow is rotation of the head. If you're not, what do we say, nodding your head left to right to say no, say with your head, you're using this odontoid process or dens as the axis of rotation, and the atlas is what's actually moving around it. So this is C2, the axis. Also, half joking and half not joking, I really think of this as the bone that keeps your head from falling off. So this sticks up and holds on to the axis, or onto the atlas. Realistically, all of your vertebrae prevent the higher part of your body from falling off, and they're held together by all those ligaments and the intervertebral discs. So it's not like your head is in imminent danger of falling off. But it helps me kind of visualize how they fit together to imagine that this is holding on to the atlas and preventing it from falling off. But that is probably not a concern. So then, I've already shown you part of what you'd see for the rest of the cervical vertebrae, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And they're going to have a spinous process. They're going to have transverse processes with transverse foramina. One thing a lot of them have is a split spinous process. It's bifid. It's split into 2 points for most of them. And that's another distinctive feature. You wouldn't see that on any other type of vertebra. And this is something I want to show you in the software again, because why not, is how the articular facets change from cervical to lumbar and thoracic. So if we look up here at this right here is the axis and the atlas. Their articular facets are like horizontal. The inferior articular facet is just inferior, the superior one is superior. But as we go down the spine, we start to see like this diagonal direction in the articular facets, and that's going to keep changing. This is where the articular facet's going to be for a thoracic vertebrae, and it's going to be almost vertical, so almost perpendicular to this. And then when we get down to the lumbar vertebrae, it changes again. It's vertical, but now it's rotated almost 90 degrees. So that's where. So instead of seeing it from this angle, you have to see it from this angle. So that is what drives a lot of the differences in the structures of the vertebrae. A lot of what you'd see when you compare them really comes down to which way the articular processes and facets are facing. And the articular processes and facets face that way to allow and prevent certain types of motion. So while I'm on this topic, the cervical vertebrae are going to allow the most motion. The neck has to be very, very movable, followed by the thoracic. But the lumbar don't move much at all. They certainly can't twist. So you can't like twist from left to right using these vertebrae because the articular facets just would prevent it perfectly. And you can't do much bending either. But that's the only kind of motion you could do, is you could bend backwards. You could do what's called extension or flexion, slight amounts of it with the lumbar. And again, if you look at how these vertebrae fit together, you'll be able to see sort of what motions are allowed and what motions would not be allowed. Okay, so let's get into the thoracic vertebrae now that I've already stolen my own thunder in this regard. The thoracic vertebrae are unique because they are thoracic. That means they're all going to articulate with the ribs. The ribs are going to protect the thoracic region of the body, or the chest. And since the thoracic vertebrae are all going to articulate with ribs, they have extra facets for articulation called costal facets. Costal refers to ribs. And so what we're going to see is that the body of a thoracic vertebra is going to have two costal facets, superior and inferior, and the transverse process is going to have one also. And the way this ends up looking, this is kind of, it's hard to see, but you really need a skeleton or this model skeleton to see it. So this is the body of a thoracic vertebra. This is the body, of another thoracic vertebra. And the rib attaches between them. So it's attaching to the inferior costal facet of this one and the superior costal facet of this one. Also, that same rib is articulating with the transverse process of the lower of the two ribs. So the transverse process of the inferior, of the inferior vertebra. So do spend some time playing with that once you get this software running, because there is no substitute for seeing the whole skeleton put together in order to understand how it works. And once you see how it's put together, you understand why these facets are where they are. So the rib would start here and would curl past here and then downward and around to the anterior side. The spinous process is always going to be posterior. The body is always going to be anterior. So the rib kind of moves out posteriorly and laterally and then curves around anteriorly. So here's where we see that. The ribs start, they move back first and then curl around. And you might be able to see it better from this angle. So you'll have to play with these angles on your own to really get this stuff. Thoracic vertebrae are really easy to identify if you've ever seen a giraffe. Because if you look at them from the posterior view where the spinous process is inferior, so as you would looking at a skeleton posteriorly, they look like that of a giraffe. And I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, part of it is that the superior articular facets are facing you, sort of at the angle you might expect, these little bumps on the head of a giraffe. But I don't want to put too much in this. It just, once you see it, it's hard to unsee. Lumbar vertebrae are the biggest, heaviest, thickest ones because they support all of the weight of the body superior to them. So they support everything the ribs protect. They support the head, the upper limbs. All that weight is transferred through these lumbar vertebrae. So if you were in a face-to-face lab, if I handed you a bucket of vertebrae, you'd know the lumbar vertebrae because they'd be the biggest, thickest, heaviest. Conversely, the cervical vertebrae would be the smallest and most delicate. All their structures would be thin because they just don't have to handle the forces that are put on the lumbar vertebrae. Lumbar vertebrae do not articulate with ribs, so they do not have costal facets. And as I mentioned before, Their articular facets, superior and anterior, face laterally and medially instead of posterior and anterior or superior and inferior. And what that does is it limits twisting of the lumbar spine while allowing flexion and extension. And that's all there is to say about that. Also, once you see it from this side, if you've ever seen a moose, you'll never be able to unsee that as a moose. So that's the lumbar vertebra. So these are the vertebrae. The three different types. Make sure if I show you any of these pictures, you can tell which type you're looking at. And here are some more pictures you can look at. And that also includes, if I show you an atlas, you have to know that it's C1 and the atlas. Same for an axis. You have to be able to call it the axis and call it C2. This is a table from the textbook that can help you review the differences between the types of vertebrae. And this is figures from the textbook. These are nice figures. This is usually where we get the figures that are in the lecture slides. But these are a little bit cleaner. So that's the vertebral column for the most part. What's left is the sacrum at the bottom, which some might consider its own bone, even though it is made from what historically were 5 vertebrae that have now fused together. And the purpose of the sacrum is to transfer, well, it's several things. But one of them is to transfer the weight of the body up above to the coxal bones, which make up the pelvis, which will then transfer all that weight to the upper or the lower limb. And lots of other things go on here. So the sacrum has a canal that goes down through it, and then from that canal are holes. And the idea is not exactly this. The spinal cord ends here, but then it sends lots of other nerves farther down into this canal, and some of those nerves come out posteriorly and some come out anteriorly. So let's see if we can see that in our software. If I turn on nervous system, yeah, there you go, spinal nerves. So these would be like your sciatic nerves, and posteriorly they'd be minor. So there would be a few minor nerves coming out. But yeah. So this is also why in some situations pressure in the pelvis during things like childbirth can damage some of the nerves that innervate the lower limb. There's a lot going on in this part of the body. There really is. This whole part of the body has the reproductive organs, but it also has massive blood vessels. The biggest artery and vein that go to the lower limb go over the top of this here. The huge tendons for your giant hip flexors go over the top here. And the digestive system, the urinary system, the reproductive system are all in here. And there's just not enough space always for all of it. So that's where your sacrum is. That's what we were just looking at here. And those big spinal nerves come out through these foramina. The sacrum is fused to the coccyx, or articulates with the coccyx. This is the tailbone. And it might offer a little bit of support, but one thing it also does is block, it blocks, well, what's the word I'm looking for? It's one of the things that limits the size of a baby that can be born through the vaginal canal. So this is a male skeleton, and what you could see is if we tried to push a baby's head through this space here, the coccyx would actually limit the size of what could be pushed through, as would these two ischial spines. If we change this to a female pelvis, you'd actually see the coccyx would be in a different position. So the female pelvis is much more open, and the coccyx is actually more posterior to make a bigger space here. So there's that. That's the majority of how I think of the coccyx. It is one of the things that would prevent a male from giving birth. One of many, 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 many things that would prevent a male from giving birth. So these are some markings of the sacrum. Okay, and that's enough for this. So we'll stop this video, and then in the next one we will cover the ribs and the bony thorax. And that will be plenty for today.